I want to tell you today about evolution and how evolution evolves. And I want to start with my hero, one of my scientific heroes. This is not George. Almost as ancient. Charles Darwin conceived, I guess, the most important theory that we have in evolution. Some might say the only theory that we have in evolution, that we have in biology. That's the theory of evolution. Nothing in biology makes sense unless in the light of the theory of evolution. This theory explains how organisms constantly adapt to their environment. In fact, the theory can explain even how living organisms have evolved from inanimate material. And I want to start by a brief introduction to the theory of evolution and then how it evolves from there. So Darwin lived in Cambridge. He studied in the other Cambridge, the original one, but he didn't stay close to home for too long. He embarked on a voyage, and for many years he actually traveled Earth and discovered. He looked at nature, marveled at it, and discovered the essence of the theory of evolution. And what I want you to take from the next few minutes is just two basic essentials of the theory of evolution. A story, and a mechanism. Okay, so what's the story? The story of evolution is a story that describes how all living organisms share a common ancestry. Okay? Darwin was interested in humans, he was interested in the rest of the living organisms, and he realized something amazing about them, about all of us, about all the living organisms that ever lived on Earth, that exist today, and that will exist in the future. Well, maybe not George Church's created organisms, but nevertheless, all the rest, according to Darwin, shared a common origin. Some 3.5 billion years ago, there was one creature on Earth, may have looked like a bacterium, and we are all descendants of this bacterium. It's us, it's the monkeys, but it's also the lizards and cucumbers and bacteria and fungi, etc., etc. We all share a common ancestor, and in a process of branching, we have diverged from one another, and some branches have given rise to the animals, others to lizards, others to plants, etc., etc. This was an amazingly bold statement. How do you know, Charles, that we all share a common ancestry? Well, he knew that with some insight. He didn't have a fraction of the information that we have today to support that notion. For example, we know that we and the cucumbers share the same type of genetic code. We share many, many features that did not have to be shared together if it wasn't for a common ancestry. So in a family tree, we and cucumbers, in my own case, it's the peppers actually, that all belong to the same ancestry. So that's the first essential of Darwin's theory, a common descent from a shared ancestry. The second is a mechanism. Is a mechanism that actually explains how this story, how this history unfolds. And what's nice about this mechanism is that it's extremely simple, or at least it gives you the illusion of being extremely simple. The mechanism consists of just three essentials, three components to it. Let me go briefly through them, using terms that are modern, not Darwin's terms, but nevertheless they are important for us. So Darwin speaks about a separation between what we call today a genotype and a phenotype. The genotype is your genes. You inherited your genes from your parents, you would inherit them to your kids. The phenotype is the way you actually look. It's the color of your eyes, the strength of your immune system, a predisposition for disease, etc., etc. According to Darwin, it's only the genotype that reproduces and passes through the generations. Okay? The genotype reproduces, but it does so with mistakes. Very, very early mistakes happen. The process of copying the genotype is extremely accurate. One makes one mistake in a billion, but nevertheless, those mistakes are essential because they generate diversity. So the first essential of Darwin's mechanism is a process that generates diversity. Different genotypes then give rise to different phenotypes. These are obvious differences among us. Some are faster, some are smarter, some are more beautiful, etc., etc. The genotype instructs the phenotype, and the third essential component in the theory is the environment. The environment assesses how good is your phenotype, whether you can run fast or whether you can digest appropriately alcohol in your liver, or whether your immune system is coping with a virus, etc., etc. The environment doesn't care at all about the genotype. All it cares for is the phenotype, good or bad, but it so happens that genotypes that happens to have instructed the most fit phenotypes get the chance to be propagated to the next generation. So important for us is to realize that this is a mechanism, a very simple mechanism that explains a very complicated scenario, an evolutionary scenario. And in that mechanism, information flows unidirectionally, bear with me, from the genotype to the phenotype and assessed by the environment. But information only flows from the genotype into the phenotype. But my lecture today is about how evolution, or the theory of evolution, has evolved over the years. And I want to tell you about a fascinating new chapter in the theory of evolution that actually suggests an interesting reversal of the flow of information, a tiny difference, but it's actually a major one. And this new chapter actually predates Darwin. It's due to this French naturalist, Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He published his publication about evolution some 50 years before Darwin's. He also realized that species evolve, but he had a slightly different idea, or perhaps radically different idea, about how they do that. Let me introduce the Lamarck's twist on Darwin's, although he preceded Darwin, with the same cartoon that we had before. So if Darwin suggests a unidirectional flow of information from the phenotype into the genotype, and only the genotype gets to be propagated from the genotype from the phenotype, Lamarck adds those two additional red arrows. The first suggests that the phenotype, in some weird cases, can reprogram your DNA. If it were in simple terms, the way your nose looks could reverse the information backwards and rewrite your genome in the region of the genome that instructs the shape of the nose. Or at least what could happen in addition is that although the phenotype might in some cases not burn back the genotype, it might be propagated, whereas in the Darwinian case, it's only the genotype that is passed on from one generation to the other. Looks weird. Let me give you an analogy, or in fact two analogies for that. This is music. We had yesterday a beautiful evening of music. Music, in this case, is burned into a genotype, a CD. This is a bit ancient example. In that respect, it could be a cloud. But the music comes from the CD. The CD is like the DNA of the music. If you just look at the CD itself, you can't hear any music coming out of it. You need a CD player to play out the information or to express it, as we say in genetics, as much as you need a cell to play out information in the DNA to express the DNA, which is indeed something that I study a lot. But it's an inherent property of CDs that they are so-called read-only devices. Namely, you can read information from them, but you cannot reprogram the information with them. But imagine now, and that would be a good analogy to a Lamarckian world, imagine now that you were listening to music, and along with the music that you hear, you sing along. Naturally, the CD would not be affected by your sing-along, but if CDs obeyed Lamarckian concepts, then in some cases, the notes that you sing along would go back to the CD and change them exactly in the right place so that the next time you hear that CD, it will already be modified with information that you have acquired it when you sang along with it. Looks weird, right? Let me give you another example. Languages also evolve. This is a particular interesting case, a drive-through that is shortened in America into a different type of writing. The dictionary dictates for us, and the set of grammars, the book of grammars, dictates for us how we should speak. In that respect, the dictionary is the DNA of the language. But we don't just exchange dictionaries with one another. We express the language, we refer to the environment in which we live, and when we do that, we often make mistakes. We generate slang, we borrow words and linguistic structures from one language to the other. But what's interesting is that today's slangs is going to be tomorrow's dictionary. So evolution of language is certainly Lamarckian because of the bidirectional flow of information from the DNA into the spoken language, but then back again from the spoken language into tomorrow's DNA. If languages were only evolving by copying dictionaries, they wouldn't get anywhere far as much as biology doesn't. And now to two interesting biological examples for what is Lamarckian evolution. If you had to explain why giraffes, or if Darwin, had to explain why giraffes have long necks, he might have said something like, well, dear, I've written about that in my Origin of Species. There were all sorts of giraffes. Some had long necks, some had short necks, and those that happened to have the long necks survived better. If you asked Lamarck, why do giraffes have long necks? He may have come up with a very weird explanation. He would say, giraffes were born with some middle-range necks, but in the environment in which there are high trees, they tried to extend their necks. And some succeeded better than others. So far, so good. But then happens a miracle, according to Lamarck, because those that extended their necks did not only survive better in the environment, they were able to transmit that information to their offsprings. So the offsprings will already be born with long extended necks. That sounds really weird. Another example. Suppose that you worked out in the gym before conceiving your kids. If Lamarckian evolution was at work, then your kids will already be born with heavier muscles. As far as we know, this is not how evolution works. This is not how genetics works, right? If you do a lot of math before conceiving your kids, that wouldn't necessarily make them stronger in math, etc., etc. I should. And indeed, immediately when Darwin's theory came out, although I think that Darwin in his heart was pro Lamarck, when his theory came out, everyone abandoned the Lamarck idea. It was actually ridiculed as being totally irrelevant, not because Darwin negated what Lamarck said, but simply because he suggested a much more parsimonious and easier to think about mechanism. And in science, we would always prefer the easier mechanism that involves less assumption than the more complicated one. But rumors began to emerge years after Lamarckian evolution was abandoned, and one of the famous indications for that came after the Second World War. After the war, in Netherlands, doctors that took care of women that suffered from starvation, known as the Dutch famine, noticed, curiously, that the kids of those children also manifested all sorts of metabolic disorders, such as type 2 diabetes, obesity, etc., etc. This is very strange. The mothers were starved, their environment was obviously different, their phenotype may have responded to that environment, but why on earth would the kids be imprinted with such information? This is so that actually returned back the notion from Lamarckian evolution of inheritance of acquired traits. And this, with additional indications, suggested that perhaps indeed evolution in some cases manifests some reversal of information from the phenotype to the genotype. And I want to now focus a little bit more on my own research on that, but I want to explain to you what are the two basic hurdles in realizing Lamarckian evolution. Why was it considered to be unlikely as a mechanism? There are two hurdles. For one, I need to introduce another term in biology. It's the soma. The soma is essentially all of your body, but the germline, the sperm cells and the egg cells, which will be transmitted to the next generation. The first obstacle towards realizing Lamarckian evolution is that you could ask yourself, how does information flow from the soma into the germline? For instance, there are experiments better conducted than this Dutch famine case in which people have starved mice, male, not the female, to proteins, and the offsprings have manifested a modified liver metabolism. How does information flow from your stomach to the sperm or the egg such that the next generation would be imprinted with that information? This is one challenge. The second challenge, if information is already embedded in the right cell, how does it go into the genome and reprogram the genome exactly in the right place, like in the nodes in the CD? How do the nodes know where to go into the CD such that they would modify rather than just making a mess in the entire DNA? So two challenges. And I focus on the second one. Essentially, no one understands how information flows from the soma into the germline. So can I allow myself not to deal with this information flow from the soma to the germline, just focus on the second one? Well, there are two interesting scenarios that actually allow us very easily to explore what happens or whether Lamarckian evolution can happen despite the challenge of soma to germline transmission if you look at unicellular organisms, namely organisms that only consist of one cell each. Bacteria, for instance, are unicellular organisms. Cancerous cells are also unicellular organisms in the sense that they don't mate sexually with one another, and they only grow by a process of cell division and proliferation. So both in cancer cells and in bacterial cells, one can ask whether Lamarckian evolution is at work, putting aside the problem of how you go from the soma into the germline and just focusing on those challenges of how you write or rewrite the genetic information according to a phenotypic experience that you have experienced at a particular environment. So in cancers, we study Lamarckian evolution and we discover interesting instances in which the genes in cancer are being reprogrammed based on information that is acquired within them when cancer cells evolve. And I can tell you more about that perhaps later on. Let me actually take you a little bit deeper into what we do in the lab towards asking whether Lamarckian processes that allow those two red arrows to actually operate. And for that, I want to introduce my last analogy. I love analogies. So here is another analogy. Imagine that you were to ask, how do technologies such as cell phones evolve? Okay? If you look at a cell phone and ask, can it evolve to do something new? The answer would typically be no, right? Apple wants me to buy a new cell phone every 2 years, but if it wanted the cell phone to evolve naturally, it would have transplanted within it something that I would call an evolvability chip. It could be a Lamarckian or a Darwinian chip, but that chip would allow the phone to upgrade itself according to environmental changes, such that if you put it inside and you wait a little, it would evolve into a new version of the phone. This doesn't happen in technology. But living organisms, I believe, all have, it's in fact a defining feature in my mind of living organisms, that they do have evolvability chips. What are evolvability chips? They have to be genes that exist in our genome, and they endow us with the capacity to actually evolve. So in my lab, we are looking for those genes. It's a hunt for the genes that if you're given more from them, you can evolve better, and if you are taken away from them, you cannot evolve. We do a complicated experiments based heavily on deep sequencing of the type that George showed you that allows us to find the evolvability genes of the genome, those genes that actually confer the capacity to evolve. Let me give you just one example for one such gene, and with that I'll conclude. The DNA was already introduced. There's another thing in our cells called RNA. And don't be mistaken by the similarity in the name. DNA and RNA are extremely different from one another. If the DNA is the genetic information that does not interact with the environment, that is copied between generations with utmost accuracy, RNA is exactly the opposite. It can adopt all sorts of shapes. It can do catalysis, much like proteins can do. It has a very interesting chemistry. It is generated with a very high error rate, And the most important, it actually interacts constantly with the environment. If I look at your DNA, I don't know what's the temperature that you're experiencing, but if I look at your RNA, I can tell if you are being starved, if you are attacked by a virus, if it's cold outside or in your body and warm. The RNA tells you a lot about the environment. It is modified by the environment. It modifies the environment. The RNA is already a phenotype. Now remember, Lamarckian evolution is all about reversal of the flow from the phenotype to the genotype. So if we only had a way to return back to reverse the process of transcription from DNA to RNA, if we had a process that reverses the flow of information, which we call reverse transcription, then the RNA could broadcast into the DNA interesting experiences that it experienced at a particular environment, and by that actually complete the Lamarckian process of expressing something, and like the slang and like the music notes, etc., return back the information into the genotype. So this is where we stand. We are investigating that process. Let me actually go back. We are investigating this process. Would it work? Yes. We are investigating this process. It's fascinating. I don't have time much to tell you about it. We believe that if we master this process and see how organisms do that, we can actually evolve organisms towards particular needs. Perhaps we can block that process from happening in cancer and generate an anti-evolution treatment for cancer. Time will tell. But here I need to conclude. I told you today about my two heroes, Mr. D, Mr. L, and here is myself between them. And I have to tell you, I was born scientifically or educated as a Darwinian evolutionary biologist. But in the environment that I lived, namely the papers that I read, I was transformed. Because when I saw about Lamarck, I changed my scientific DNA. I became a Lamarckian evolutionist myself. And I inherit this information to my scientific offspring. So 2 students in my lab, not all of them are following that. 2 students in my lab are actually actively doing research in Lamarckian evolution. So it's a nice realization that one can change according to the topic of your research. And what I may have done today is actually to transmit those memes rather than genes to you. So if you buy this issue, you're Lamarckists by yourselves now. Thank you very much.